Picture this, a legendary aerospace company bets its entire future on one final aircraft. They take a proven classic, stretch it, modernize it, and launch it to fight the giants of Boeing and Airbus. But instead of saving the company, this plane accelerates its demise. So why, decades after its manufacturer ceased to exist, were there still around 65 of these giants operating critical missions around the world? What unique capability made them indispensable when better, safer planes were available? And why has a single crash in Louisville suddenly brought this 30-year saga to a terrifying halt? Here is what is really happening. If you ask most aviation enthusiasts why the MD-11 failed as a passenger jet, they will give you a very standard list of reasons. And on the surface, they are right. The aircraft simply did not do what the brochure said it would do. When McDonnell Douglas pitched this jet to the world in the late 80s, they promised a machine that could fly nearly 7,000 nautical miles with a full load of passengers, competing directly with the rising stars from Boeing and Airbus. But when the first customers actually got their hands on it, the reality was disappointing. The plane fell short of its range targets by 500 to 800 nautical miles. For an airline trying to fly from Singapore to Europe or Los Angeles to Hong Kong, that gap is not just a statistic, it is a disaster. It means stopping for fuel when you promised your passengers a non-stop flight. Worse, it burned 5 to 10% more fuel than advertised. In an industry where profit margins are measured in pennies, a miss on fuel efficiency is catastrophic. Airlines were paying more to fly a plane that could not go as far as they needed. Then there was the reputation. Pilots whispered about the MD-11. They called it sittish. It earned a reputation for tricky handling, particularly during landing. The aircraft was equipped with a smaller tailplane to reduce drag, which meant it relied heavily on a computer system called the Longitudinal Stability Augmentation System, or LSAS, to keep it flying straight. When things went wrong, they went wrong quickly. High-profile accidents like the tragic crash of Swissair Flight 111 in 1998, the flip-over of China Airlines Flight 642 in 1999, and the crash of FedEx Flight 14 in Newark in 1997 cemented the idea that this plane was dangerous. Add in the arrival of the twin-engine Boeing 777, which was more efficient and easier to fly, and the fate of the MD-11 seemed sealed. Airlines dumped them. Most were gone from passenger service by the mid-2000s, with the very last passenger flight landing in 2014. But if the plane was such a lemon, why did it not disappear? Why in early 2025 were there still around 65 of them flying daily missions for the biggest logistics companies on Earth? The standard explanation does not account for that. This situation seems completely illogical. Consider the pedigree. The MD-11 was not a clean sheet gamble. It was the descendant of the DC-10, a workhorse that had been built 446 times in total. It was supposed to be the refined, modernized version of a proven success. It had a two-crew glass cockpit, removing the need for a flight engineer. It had aerodynamic winglets. It had improved engines. When it launched in 1986, 52 firm orders were placed immediately. The industry wanted this plane to succeed. McDonnell Douglas promised it would offer lower operating costs and modern efficiency, so we have a plane with a royal lineage, modern technology, and strong initial demand. Yet the very customers it was designed for, the passenger airlines, rejected it almost immediately. They did not just slowly phase it out, they got rid of it as fast as they contractually could. But here is the contradiction. While airlines were selling them at a loss, cargo operators were snapping them up like they were made of gold. These shrewd business operators saw something the passenger airlines missed. They took these failed airframes, converted them into freighters, and flew them profitably for decades. How can the same set of wings be a financial disaster for carrying people, but a financial miracle for carrying boxes? To understand this, we have to go back to the moment the MD-11 was born, because its fate was sealed long before the first metal was cut. The story really begins in the 1980s. McDonnell Douglas, once a titan of aerospace, was fighting for its life. They were losing market share rapidly to Boeing's 747 and the rising threat of Airbus. They needed a new airplane to compete, but they had a massive problem. They had no money. Cash-strapped and facing pressure from military contract issues and weak commercial sales, the company leadership made a critical, fatal decision. They decided they could not afford to build a brand new airplane from scratch. Instead, they would take the low-risk path. They would warm over the old DC-10. design. They stretched the fuselage by 18 feet to carry more people. To squeeze out efficiency without spending billions on a new wing, they shrank the horizontal stabilizer, the tail wing, by 30%. A smaller tail means less drag, which saves fuel, but a smaller tail also means less stability. To compensate for this instability, they installed a fuel tank in the tail to act as ballast and relied on the computer-driven LSAS to keep the nose level. It was a clever engineering band-aid, but it was a compromise. Because of financial constraints, they retained much of the heavy, older structure of the DC-10 instead of using modern, lightweight materials. They could not afford the clean sheet innovations that Boeing was pouring into the 777, so in 1986, McDonnell Douglas launched a plane that was essentially a 1970s design dressed up in 1980s technology, trying to fight against competitors who were building for the 21st century. They were bringing a knife to a gunfight, and they hoped nobody would notice. As soon as the plane entered service, the cracks in this strategy shattered wide open. The performance shortfalls were not just numbers on a page, they were operational nightmares. Airlines were furious. They faced higher than expected fuel costs on every single flight. The maintenance bills started piling up. The handling quirks that pilots talked about turned into real incidents. Then came the crashes. The FedEx Flight 14 disaster in Newark in 1997 and the Swissair tragedy in 1998 did not just destroy hulls, they destroyed confidence. The public began to fear the three-engine silhouette. Meanwhile, the competition was ruthless. Boeing flew the 777 in 1994. It was a twin-engine marvel that could fly just as far, carry just as much, and do it with 2 engines instead of 3. The relaxed ETOPS rules meant that 2 engines were no longer a liability for crossing oceans. The pressure on McDonnell Douglas became unbearable. The airlines were cancelling orders. The reputation of the MD-11 was in freefall. In 1997, the inevitable happened. McDonnell Douglas collapsed and merged with Boeing. Boeing had no interest in saving a competitor to their own 777. They looked at the MD-11 order book, saw the problems, and pulled the plug. Production ended around the year 2000 with only 200 aircraft delivered. A plane that was projected to sell over 300 units was dead. But here is where the story should have ended. The MD-11 should have been parked in the desert and forgotten, but it wasn't. The failure of the MD-11 wasn't just about bad engineering, it was about a failure of corporate strategy. McDonnell Douglas tried to fight an efficiency war with a derivative design. They tried to patch up an old airframe to meet new standards, and they failed. But while the corporate strategy failed, the physical metal had a secret weapon. The very compromises that ruined it for passengers made it perfect for something else. See, passengers are picky. They care about ride comfort. Airlines care about cost per seat mile. But boxes don't complain about hard landings. Boxes don't care if the plane is a little loud. The MD-11 failed as a passenger jet because it couldn't compete on efficiency and range with the new twins. But the structure, that heavy DC-10 heritage structure, was tough. And that 18-foot stretch that McDonnell Douglas added, that created a massive main deck volume. This is where the second life begins. Enter the cargo giants, FedEx, UPS, and later Western Global Airlines. They looked at the MD-11 and saw something different. They saw a plane that could carry 90 to 93 tons of cargo. They saw a plane with a massive side cargo door. They saw a plane with plenty of range for their specific needs, perfect for a heavy cargo run from Anchorage to Tokyo. But the most important number wasn't range or payload, it was price. Because the passenger airlines hated them, the value of used MD-11s plummeted. Cargo airlines could buy a 10-year-old MD-11 for a fraction of the cost of a new freighter. A new Boeing 777 freighter might cost over $300 million. A used MD-11, you could pick one up for $10 to $20 million. Suddenly, the fuel inefficiency didn't matter as much. When you pay so little for the plane, you can afford to burn a little more gas. The tricky handling was manageable because cargo pilots flew these routes day in and day out. They became experts at taming the beast. The MD-11 became the Goldilocks freighter. It was bigger than a 767 but cheaper than a 747. It fit perfectly into the hub and spoke networks of FedEx and UPS. The failure became the workhorse. To really appreciate this, you have to look at the alternatives. Look at the Boeing 777. It was a clean sheet design. It had ETOPS certification from day one. It was efficient, safe, and loved by airlines. It dominated the long-haul passenger market and later the freighter market. With over 2,000 built, it was the success story that the MD-11 wanted to be. Or look at the ancestor, the DC-10. Even though it had its own controversies, 446 were built, and it enjoyed a long career carrying passengers before transitioning to cargo. The MD-11 was the awkward middle child. It didn't have the clean sheet perfection of the 777, nor the longevity of the DC-10. It was a bridge aircraft, a derivative that arrived just as the world changed. But think about this, for 20 years, if you ordered a package from across the world, there was a very high chance it flew on an MD-11. That failed aircraft was likely sitting on the tarmac at Memphis or Louisville, being loaded with your holiday gifts. However, a second life is not an immortal life. The cargo years were not without their own crises. The sittish landing characteristics never went away. In 2009, a FedEx MD-11 flipped over and burned in gusty conditions at Narita Airport in Japan. It was a stark reminder that the design compromises made in the 80s were still lurking in the flight control software. Engine issues plagued the fleet. The engines were powerful, but they were working hard. The maintenance was demanding. And then came the final blow. On November 4, 2025, the story took its darkest turn. UPS Flight 2976. The engine detachment on takeoff was not just a mechanical failure, it was a catastrophic structural failure. The crash claimed 14 lives, including victims on the ground. This wasn't just a bad landing, this was a sign that perhaps the airframes, pushed to their limits for 35 years, were finally giving up. The effective worldwide grounding that followed was immediate. Regulators and Boeing, who inherited the mess, had no choice. So, what does the story of the MD-11 actually tell us? It is the story of the end of an era. The MD-11 was the last great tri-jet. It marked the moment when the aviation industry decided that 2 engines were better than 3. It marked the death of McDonnell Douglas, a company that once ruled the skies but died because it stopped innovating. But it also tells us about the ruthlessness of the market. An aircraft is a tool. If it cannot make money carrying people, the market will ruthlessly discard it. But if it can make money carrying boxes, the market will squeeze every last drop of life out of it. The MD-11 proves that failure in aviation is relative. Was it a failure? It kept the global supply chain moving for 3 decades. It generated billions of dollars in revenue for FedEx and UPS. It outlived the company that built it. Let us look at the cold, hard data. Only 200 MD-11s were ever built. That is a tiny number compared to the thousands of Boeings and Airbuses. Of those 200, only about 136 were passenger or combi aircraft, and most of those were retired from major fleets within 15 to 20 years. But look at the cargo adoption. Until the crash in November 2025, around 65 of those original 200 were still active. That is a retention rate that defies logic for a failed plane. Yes, the hull loss rate was higher than its peers. Yes, it was dangerous, but the economics, the $10 million purchase price versus the $300 million competitor, kept it alive. You see, the MD-11 was a disaster that found a purpose. It was a plane born from compromise, rejected by its parents, but adopted by a new family that put it to work. It was a beast to fly, a fuel guzzler, and a corporate killer, but for 30 years, it was also the king of the night cargo run. Today, as the fleet sits grounded following the tragedy in Louisville, we are likely looking at the final chapter. The inspections are ongoing, but the age of the airframes and the severity of the crash suggest that the MD-11 has finally run out of time. Click here to check out another one of our videos.